improvement purposes, but it's possible. All right, so everyone is here, if my calculation is correct. So I'm glad that last time we actually did some philosophy. We actually tried to define some terms and think through some of the basic concepts. In a lot of philosophy classes that I've taken, we discuss what we think philosophy is and what some of the major concepts are in the beginning. And then at the end, in the last lecture, we have another discussion that's similar about that to see if anyone's mind has changed. But to be honest, I think everyone had a coherent and somewhat similar views on what philosophy is, what spirituality is in general. So that was nice to know that your life experiences have kind of converged into the same life philosophy, if that makes sense. So today is going to be a little more lecture style. I'm going to be taking a swift kind of breeze through the history of Western philosophy, and we'll be discussing a little bit of nuance along the way. So I actually have some notes that I'm going to be going by that were from my own master's seminars, and kind of be skipping around. So there's a difference between history of philosophy and the history ideas, because philosophy ideas are kind of atomized concepts in and of themselves, whereas philosophy tries to provide a context for how it is that ideas make sense, if that makes sense. And history of philosophy, for that reason, is quite selective among ideas through time. And the burning of the library in Alexandria actually was kind of a self-filtering mechanism for which ideas Western thought has decided to stick with, because there's a lot of ancient wisdom that was kept in that library that is now gone, that is now lost to us. And that was, unless anyone has an exact date, the range was pre-Greek. It was between Egyptian and Greek times. You know, that's actually it's a good question. Let me see if I can pull that in.
Does anybody have any idea what all was in there?
So
many centuries ago.
Yeah. There are many occultists who are attempting to uncover some of that ancient wisdom. So there was a lot about the stars, astronomy, and astrology. Astrology, the affix being rooted in logos, which roughly is translated to the spoken truth, or sort of human conceptual truth that we draw from such a subject. So biology is about seeing the truth and the patterns in anatomy. It's the logic of the biosphere, we could say. And so astrology, similarly, astro meaning of the stars of the universe, logi, logos, the truth that we can extract from that matter. So it's not necessarily about the physical matter itself, it's about what are the pattern truths that we can pull out of that.
So the other course that you're offering is an astrology.
It is.
So
Yeah.
Is that where your interest ties?
It's
philosophy?
there is a lot of overlap. Yeah. I can say that all of the roads that I've taken have converged and are relevant to one another. As much as I like to fit things in boxes and not overlap things, have to admit that my studying of philosophy was kind of about more general truth, and what led me to astrology is about the more subjective aspect of truth. Everyone's born with their own birth chart, which is supposed to represent their innate, individual, unique predispositions and perceptions. And so, my interest in both the general and the individual and subjective have to converge at some point, right? So there's a lot of wisdom about astrology from the Hellenistic period, which was between the Egyptian period and then the shift over to India and the Vedic, where the Vedic sciences sort of sprouted from. So they come from the same place, actually, and a lot of that ancient wisdom was logged in the Library of Alexandria. It burnt down, and a lot of that knowledge was lost. And so Western philosophy kind of, I'm not going to say, picked and chose what it wanted to go with, but it went with what it had. And so there are certain concepts that are important to us in academia, education to this day, that are obviously tied in with the rest of that knowledge that we're not gaining a full sense of because we don't have the total view of ancient knowledge over time. And Western thought has kind of sprouted out of what remained from that catastrophe. So it's said that the burning of Alexandria ridded us of the rubbish, which encompasses most of the library, namely occult subjects, which are still sort of given a bad name in mainstream academic to this day, as well as mainstream religions. It's one of the only things, ironically, that people who otherwise have very opposing life views can actually agree on, is that astrology is rubbish or it's evil, but it kind of equates to the same claim. Astrology is just one of many examples of things that kind of survived, but continue to throughout every religious paradigm, every scientific paradigm, every cultural shift. It's one of those subjects that kind of keeps coming back to haunt us. And so it's kind of has a life force unto itself and says, hey, pay attention to me. I have something you might want to know that isn't necessarily confined to the context of any particular culture, because it has spanned several cultures and has been improved upon. That knowledge has been recovered and improved upon since and continues to. So the burning of Alexandria ridded us of much of the rubbish, which encompasses most of the library, leaving the good to remain. We assume it's good because it's what we have. All right.
Like history is written by the victors.
Right. Yeah. No, it perfectly said. One of the good things we could say is Homer's Odyssey, which was one of the few texts that survived the burning of Alexandria, which ended up being on everyone's nightstand for a few centuries following that. Plato was one of the first that we have a record of that in a formal way raised questions of being. So the concept of being our existence, the existence of anything, what does it mean to exist? Is our existence confined to the functional biology within us, and the fact that we can categorize our existence as a species as both similar and different to other species, land, animals, plants. There's this thing called life that we assume has some intrinsic quality, that everything that's alive, even things that evolve much more slowly than we do, like rock formations, seem to have some life force to them. That life isn't necessarily confined to, say, carbon-based, living, breathing substances. So what does it mean to be? And when we get more deeply into consciousness, we'll talk more about that. Over time in religious history, many prominent religious figures also took the role of being philosophers, who also raised questions of being, explored that question within the context of their own religious life. Is being something that is granted to us by God? What is God? On some sense, that's presupposed, depending on what form you believe God takes, whether it's a sky daddy, a guy in the sky, or the collective consciousness that all of that aforementioned life seems to share. And again, even though this is kind of more of a lecture than last time, I'm not starting off with a question. Feel free to raise your hand and interject at any point if you like. So, is there a connection between being and consciousness and God? Is there something fundamental about all three of those things that everything is sort of instilled with? So in a sense, to return to the question, what is philosophy? So far, it seems like whether you're St. Augustine or Plato or the dude who burnt down the library in Alexandria, everyone seems concerned with this question of what is being, who are we, and what is the essence of things? So philosophy is about essence beyond the physical. So out of the strictly, because for a period after the ancient Greeks, after the Romans, the Romans were very concerned with Stoic philosophy. So following Plato's metaphysics about being, about forms, what's the essence of a chair, say? We're going to pick on chairs anytime we talk about the essence of things. It's a classic example. What makes a chair a chair? It can't be its physical constructive components, strictly speaking, because a chair takes many forms insofar as we understand the concept of chair, right? It can be this chair with wheels on it, but a chair doesn't have to have wheels. It can be a bar stool. It can be a beanbag chair. It can be a rock. So is it in terms of an object's functionality that we define chair or claim that something is a chair? So Plato thought that there was a realm, I guess we could say, of forms that was metaphysical. That there was this meta-spatial, meta-temporal realm. It's not about something's existence in time or space, but rather the transcendental form that something takes that gives rise to its function, that gives rise to its constituent parts. So we can decide to build, any of us can decide to build a chair ourselves. It's going to look differently. And it may even serve different functions other than sitting in it, but we're at least going to be able to do that. So there's this realm that is beyond the physical that, in a sense, grants something's existence to it. There's a form chair. There's a form table. There's a form teacher, a form student. There's a form book. Not all books are the same. A book can be an audio book. Technology is providing us with a whole host of examples for things being not what they thought they were. including book. You can listen to an audiobook, and it's not necessarily someone reading out of a physical copy of a book. Where is the physical book, right? But we still call it a book if we're listening to it on our phone. Phone is another example of something that's taken a different form, right? It can still call, it can still text, it can still do all the other things. Well, that's pretty much all we used to think that a phone could do. But it can record me doing a lecture for you guys. Everyone with me so far? Easy enough. So out of that Greek period came the Roman period, which was primarily concerned with a philosophy that seems relevant to the culture at the time. The Romans conquered many lands, expanded all throughout Europe, all across the Mediterranean region. And in order to conquer new lands, it can't strictly be all, I guess, impulsive action, impulsive militaristic bloodshed. There needs to be some presence of mind, some calmness of mind in order to make that actually work, and then to form a civilized society that's not completely and utterly tyrannical, right? So many of the Roman elites, including emperors like Marcus Aurelius, were Stoic philosophers themselves. So instead of mere armchair philosophers, as in the Greek symposium, as Plato kind of was, we had more military leaders, people of culture, people who are actually getting out and leading and organizing in society, who were doing the thinking. And in order to do that well, you had to have some calmness and stillness of mind. And so Stoicism is about ridding yourself of emotional influence in pursuit of what is true. But at the same time, having a certain degree of compassion that makes you at least come off as a virtuous leader, so that people don't stone you to death as soon as you walk out of your temple,
So Stoicism is like acceptance of what is?
In a strict way, yeah, we could say that, because it's about observation over impulsive reaction to things. It's about internalizing. There's a lot, actually, at this time, quite a bit of influence from the East, from the Zen masters of the day, who were all about that, right? Stillness of mind and observing things as they come, and not letting your expectations and your emotional influence cloud you from what is, right? So Stoicism, interestingly enough, is quite popular right now, and has been for the last few years among non-academic, educated and non-educated people alike. It kind of has a cultural resurgence in light of people being too sensitive, in certain circles of our culture. The stillness of mind and being able to observe things as they are can be, useful in terms of holding on to your principles in light of all the distractions that we face. If you open up social media, you're immediately blasted with sensory data and visual videos and things that are kind of meant to distract you from what you even opened the app for to begin with, which was maybe to message someone on when they'd like to meet up for a drink, or to look up a bit of information. You're immediately torn away from that. So
Does Stoicism, I don't mean to take over.
oh, no worries.
Does Stoicism, I don't want to say glorify, but focus on the mind rather than the emotional And when you say that still have compassion, does
Hmm.
that also kind of bring emotion back in some way?
Sure. Yeah, and great question. And that's where the balance needs to be found because the main focus was on the intellect. It was on the intellect as that special part of us that other animals don't have, which is an argument that we can have on its own. But it was more focused on in terms of compassion meeting the intellect where it needs to be in their eyes. That was for pragmatic use. That was so that um, a political leader had that stillness of mind and that kind of hardened intellect, but so that he didn't become a tyrannical, singularly focused. The intellect likes to channel, likes to narrow focus. And that's where the mad scientist syndrome comes from, right? Which philosophers are just as guilty of, even though they're all about the big picture. Philosophers can, well, especially in academia, when you write a dissertation, it's usually on one problem, and you're going as deeply as you can into all of the literature, all the relevant literature into that problem as possible, and not necessarily giving all that much focus to the big picture and where it fits into the rest of thought. But if it's a good thesis, then it should give some context as well, right? So that was the warning against the mind that Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, the good Stoics that we can point to, attempted at least a well-rounded view that compassion has a rational component to it in and of itself, that it doesn't make rational sense to have such a hardened mind that you can't relate because there's still a human element of relation and communication. You know, your hard Stoic ideas aren't going to be understood if they're not felt.
So there's where you come across with the point of the Romans stoic with compassion. Because when I think stoic, I think flat, non-compassionate, non-empathetic. But yet you're describing a group who were leaders who had a stoic philosophy, but also were compassionate and empathetic.
Right. It sounds cold and dry,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
I think there are probably some texts that didn't survive for that reason, though, because any idea takes its own form once it's integrated into a culture. Once a leader starts to gain followers because of his ideas, the cult effect of people coming together in a group can run with that idea and take it down a path that the original thinker did not intend. You know, so as much as Marcus Aurelius was a man of the people as an emperor of Rome, I'm absolutely certain, without being able to back it with any contextual knowledge, that there were many facets of the culture of the day that took the ideas down the cold hard truth path. Yeah, that didn't stick, and texts to go along with that didn't survive. You know, we could give value to something, judge something's value in terms of how much it survives through time, how many political paradigms can it withstand, cultural paradigms, scientific paradigms, if it remains through being tested by time and being tested by many contexts, then there must be something true to it, right? That's not to say that because something is old, it's good. That would be the fallacy of origin, or appeal to origin, which is in Western philosophy an error, right? To say it's good because it's old. I mean, Farmer's Almanac, you know, we can give it.
I think that's not right.
Well, there's something to it. In strict logical terms, it's an error. If you're basing your justification of your claim on only that, then it's erroneous, right? But like, it's nothing is true because it's old, but it might be old because it's true, I would say.
So from Greek to Roman, a big paradigm shift.
It was quite a paradigm shift, kind of out of the ether and a little more into culture. Because the Greeks were trying to sort out this whole logic thinking thing in the context of uh, a massive Renaissance period. And Western culture, in a sense, was just becoming civilized and just getting started. Socrates, maybe we'll spend one class on Socrates and the Socratic dialogues. But Socrates was put to death for his ideas, for questioning the mainstream narrative of the day, right? And he was really a bad boy in culture. I mean, he would go around just explaining that people didn't have logical proof for believing what they believed, that they were just kind of shooting from the hip all the time. And people don't really like that, generally speaking. But the Socratic dialogues are funny. But it was all in pursuit of the good life. He was someone who was concerned with what was true regardless of context. So he was looking at the culture, attempting to look at the culture of Athens from an anti-cultural perspective, because he wasn't interested in group affiliations, kind of a lone wolf thinker. So speaking out against the group has its consequences if it's not done with a certain amount of compassion and tact, all right? And that's what the Romans were quite conscious of. They're like, all right, how do we kind of do the same thing that Socrates and Plato were doing without the consequence of being burned at the stake? Okay, let's apply Stoic philosophy to militaristic pursuits, toward government pursuits. And let's try to find some pragmatic use for ideas that are useful beyond pragmatic uses, right? That I always use the example or the analogy of life is a river and we're floating down it on a raft. And at any point we can bank our raft and hop up on the hill and see the next bend and see what's coming, so that we can better prepare for it, maybe gather some supplies and reinforce our raft, maybe build, if we've damaged our oar, maybe build a new oar. But at some point, if we want to go anywhere, if we want to progress, we have to go with where life is taking us. We have to get back on the raft and continue to float down the river. So the Stoics were all about the perspective of being up on that hill and knowing that, all right, we got to get back on the raft. But actually, as the emperor, I don't really have to get back on the raft. It's them who are on the raft already. I'm just trying to guide them and warn everyone of what's around the next bend. So set up your defenses and have a large military and be prepared for what's around that next bend. But at the same time, give them the philosophy and the individual tools of stillness of mind in order to navigate their own raft down their own river of life, let's say. So they were trying to help people on the individual level pursue what was right for them, but that everyone still had a part to play in this greater, social structure. So as far as Stoicism takes quite a lofty ivory tower perspective. If you actually read the philosophy itself, a lot of it may not seem to be grounded in societal norms, like how is it that we all get along and connect. But it provides an internal structure of mind for each individual for attaining at least intellectual peace. All right. How can each individual improve the way in which they see around the next bend once they park their raft before hopping back onto it? So following that, religious figures such as St. Augustine kind of took the reins after the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity. most philosophers were leading some kind of organized religious life, and they focused on virtue. St. Augustine had his wager argument that was in some ways founded in Stoicism, like, to really generalize. St. Augustine said that how is it that we seek the good life within the context of a religious one? Because this is the path, this is where everyone's authority lies, is in the Christian God, insofar as we understand that. And for being a religious figure of the day who eventually became a saint, he was actually quite agnostic in his philosophy, in the sense that he said, I'm really not sure if God exists or if heaven exists, but we should live as if it does, so that if we face judgment one day, we'll have done enough, right? So that religion is actually providing us with a practical approach to living the good life. Eudaimonia, as the term was coined by Socrates.
So basically, with everything that you're saying, somebody somewhere made up a way for people to live. I mean, it's not a truth. I mean, That's the thing. It's like they said, well, we can't have everybody attacking each other with swords and axes if we're going to like survive. So let's instill these notions to make it the norm, and it's still what happens today, but it's more micromanaged today than it ever was in some sense. But on the other hand, I guess if you were to leave your realm, your safe kingdom, and wander, you'd probably get killed by somebody anyway. So, but somebody was inventing all of this. I mean, even Socrates coming up with, well, let's name that, and so he gave it the name, and then people conform because everybody was lost. They didn't have to like just kill or be killed anymore. They're all of a sudden in this structured society where they have to play a part. So there's the leaders, and the vast amount of people are just followers. They're like, dictate to us and we will comply because you're keeping us safe. And the people who are saying, because this is the truth, they didn't know if it was a truth. It was the way they wanted it to be.
Yeah, no, excellent set of points there. And that is what Saint Augustine was kind of pointing at. He's like, this is life as we know it right now. This is the general context that we're situated in. This is what we've inherited. And we're all seeking eudaimonia. We're all seeking the good life through different means throughout time. And we're working with what we got. And there was something about that for whatever reason, stuck with the Catholics to the extent that they still granted him sainthood. Although Catholicism unto itself, meaning universal, the universal way, in light of the fact that there are upwards of 300 Protestant denominations that have, since broken off of that, they still granted him what was philosophically due to him, and made him a saint. So, the cultural context, whether we're talking about Catholicism or scientism or whatever the case may be, in whatever circle you run into or run with, is a means to an end, in a sense. And the end itself is supposed to be treated as such. But like I said before, and as was the case with Socrates, the group effect of formulating a cult around that original pursuit of the good life tends to in some cases, what seems to be spin out of control and venture away from that original sacred pursuit of the good life that we all seek. We all seek love. We all seek peace. We all seek some source of faith and understanding and being. And so, I found in my cultural experiences and in my travels, haven't been everywhere in the world, but I've been to enough different places to know that people are individually more the same than different. And we're all seeking the same thing, eudaimonia, in a word. And there are different ways of going about that. Yeah, the religion of the day is what St. Augustine acknowledged quite clearly was just that, a means to the same end that rational beings have been seeking across time. And throughout the history of Western thought, which continues to get more and more of the mind and more complex as we'll go along here. Complex intellectually, but it kind of waxes and wanes, because there are movements that of enlightenment, of cultural expression that seem very freeing and liberating, that instill and empower individuals within the context of groups, and then those get more and more organized. Those regularities that come from that become more organized and formulate into religions of sorts or, institutions. And then those things fall. And then we're back to square one, and an enlightenment or a renaissance happens. And there's a cyclical effect in terms of how ideas are actually integrated into culture and for individuals. And so I sense that we're in a period of great change at the moment. When you observe the divisiveness in politics, that's just beyond anyone's ability to doubt. But then the fact that it's still possible, like the claims that are made from one side against the other, even from groups that are traditionally atheistic, will say that the other side is evil. They'll use those lofty terms, but then on the individual level, you can still get along with someone who voted for, a different person. If you actually open your mind and your heart to connection as the priority, right? So in a sense, it still comes down to values. And so we're constantly shifting our values, if we're on the right path toward eudaimonia, but the good life meaning something that's good for us and for everyone else too. Like if everyone took this path and did what I'm doing, what kind of universal effect would that actually have? And everyone can have their own style, their own, personality, means of personality expression in their pursuit of what's true and what's good and what provides you with a sense of home. But at the end of the day, it's still those fundamental values that we're constantly having to express in different ways because culture has such a quick cyclical effect of trying to put us into this box or that box. And so the rebel, I like exploring ideas, but I don't really like when a cult forms around an idea, because I see the same thing in each of those groups, even if their ideas are logically incompatible, right? So raises the question is, even though we can't point to logic in nature, mathematics in nature, we can't point to a 7. Like scientific knowledge or mathematical knowledge seems to be something that we discover. And I'm kind of lumping math and science, math and logic into the same category in terms of being a left brain thing that doesn't seem to have its foundation in stuff, in matter, but it's a tool that we use to express the regularities that we observe in nature.
So as you're sharing, I'm going back to your statement as from when you were traveling. There are more similarities than differences. You were talking about people.
At the
and I
core.
think that's very true of ideas and philosophies and other things.
Right.
If you look for the similarities instead of focusing always on the differences, it's a whole different world.
Right. And that can be misconstrued to, oh, you belong to this cult. I do too, but like another sect of it over here, oh, we have something in common. No. So that's where the reverse effect happens. And you find that there's actually more variability within a group than there are differences among groups at the same time. So that's the paradox, right? But in terms of core values, we are seeking eudaimonia, the good life, and that's what Socrates was trying to get at. That's what all the great philosophers of the past were trying to aim their philosophy toward. Even with respect to some that you might disagree with, Karl Marx was a crazy communist and Heidegger was a crazy Nazi, right? But at the core of both of their philosophies, they were actually trying to find what is going to unify. They got a little overly intellectual in the process, both of them. But the core value is something that can be expressed as being of the same fundamental substance. So what is that substance?
I like your addition of variabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Similarities, differences, and variabilities. I like that.
Yeah, so in terms of personality studies, which is my other thing, not just astrology, but Myers-Briggs, Big Five theory, explored a lot of literature on that. Herman brain dominance model is good for business. They're all kind of conceptions of the same thing, and that's innate personality traits. My journey was such that, I started off with the kind of more popular stuff like Myers-Briggs, which puts you into one of 16 categories. And once I mastered that system, I found that there was more variability within each personality type than there were differences among the 16 types. So there's more than 16 differences between like me as an INTP and someone else as an INTP. In some regards, we're not at all the same. Even though someone who's pursuing truth through that as a means, the truth of how it is that we're all different can't strictly be confined to 16 types. So we have like the same value that's drawing us to that thing. Some people are satisfied with that surface analysis and others are not. So I had to move on from it because I was like, well, just because I mastered the system, it doesn't mean that I've mastered the human personality in and of itself. Where is there another system that can account for more nuance, all right? So in a sense, any good philosophy of life is kind of doing the same thing. And that's where a lot of disagreement happens in the context of religious pursuits toward the good life, is that there's so much nuance in the Bible, in the Quran, in certain Hindu texts and Buddhist texts and Zen texts. There's so much nuance. I would say that a lot of the Eastern texts are trying to strip away content. They're trying to get to the root of oneness within ourselves and in all of nature. And I think that's a really good idea. And it's one of the things that Western culture has missed out on for a long time. We get too caught up in the nuance of what Scripture said right here, as opposed to how the overarching philosophy is aimed toward the same pursuit of truth and happiness over there as well. And so nuance can be distracting. So we need some kind of filtering mechanism, and the same thing is the case in a lot of these hyper-intellectual philosophical circles. We get lost in nuance and lose sight of the context. And so that's where religion can, really get sticky and really show people become fundamentalists in terms of the nuances of Scripture describing every single aspect of life as we can possibly know it and should know it, and not giving credit to any other equivalencies in other cultures and other texts. It's a huge mistake. that in itself is a divisive way to live and to pursue your own good life. You know?
Seeing the forest from the trees.
Right. We're constantly should be dilating and constricting our focus, zooming in, zooming out. You know, that requires, again, filtering mechanisms of having good tools of logic that come from either education or experience, and learning from your mistakes, you know, or learning from other people's mistakes. You learn what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong, and you're better able to filter your perception for things over time. Sometimes you have to look at the big picture more so because, you know, these people I'm working with over here are going deep into this subject, but this department isn't talking to this department, you know, so that's a more forest oriented. They're focused on the trees over here. Good. Somebody has to focus on those details. But what's tying it together and making everything into a well-oiled machine, right? Whether it's in the context of a business that's, you know, fit for a particular purpose, or society at large. Constantly have to constrict our focus to the specific and dilate so we can see the general. And there are personality nuances. Some people are good at one of those things and others are a lot better at the other thing, you know? And that's even more reason to make connection itself one of the overarching values whenever we're having an argument about politics, you know? It's not necessarily that we have to find where it is that we agree, where is the common ground. There might logically not be any place where we can figure that out. But I've seen a lot of people over the last 3 years lose touch with their family members or be disowned by their own loved ones because they were too focused on external truth rather than the value of the truth in connection with their own family and what value that affords you over time and how that has a positive impact on your own journey regardless of the nuances, you know? So example over the last 3 years of people losing sight of the forest and getting too caught up in the trees, of the media not getting the trees right. No crap. Shocking. You know? Really? They're making the trees orange, you know, instead of brown and green. Like, hey, some trees actually are orange at a certain point in the seasons, you know, everything's cyclical. So out of this religious phase came rationalism, Descartes raising questions of doubt about what can the tools of human rationality account for and not account for. One thing he thought he was certain about, I think, therefore I am. Okay. I feel like that was just kind of something he fell back on because he didn't really want to deal with externals enough. I cannot doubt that which I cannot know, but then you have to deal with what is knowledge and account for the different kinds of knowledge. And is that hyperfocus on knowledge itself, what we gain from external reality, because that's in a sense what knowledge is. We're gaining something from observing externals. When taken to the extreme, does that become anthropocentric? Does it kind of place human beings and the human mind at the center of the universe? And so at this time, there was actually, just like there is today, in a resurgence, debate on what the shape of the earth was. You know? Because there's so much focus on gaining from externals that we get hyper-focused on externals, and that ends up reducing to physicalism or materialism, that we're sort of giving too much credit to the physical aspects of reality and not enough to the more divine ones that eudaimonia is at least subconsciously aiming us toward.
Do I remember correctly that Descartes is actually the one that told the Pope, you stay with spirituality, let us do the thinking? Basically the separation of spirituality from philosophy.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure. Can't verify that historical fact. Because at the moment I'm more, that's one of the trees in the forest, which I don't recall. But that would be a rationalistic, in terms of rationalism being the way of thought of the day, it would certainly be from that time, because once the philosophers broke off from the church, around the time of the Reformation is when rationalism was really hitting its stride in terms of the human intellect being the center focal point of determining what is true and not really giving enough credit to narrative, to oral tradition, which is what the church was still concerned with. And it was really the other side of the puzzle, which even people to this day take as fiction, even if there is some overlying truth to it without being able to verify those historical facts from scripture, if that makes sense. So the difference between fact and truth, one of the arguments against the validity of scripture is that it's not a historically accurate document because we can't verify it. But we also can't not verify it. There needs to be a mechanism for refutation as well as verification. And this is one of my main arguments if somebody tells me like astrology is horse crap because we can't prove that there's a causal relationship between like where Venus is in the sky and how you express your romantic personality or something like that. I say, well, conversely, you don't have a mechanism for refuting it, but actually we can take certain statistics through various means. It's not going to be done academically because academia is one of the institutions that's kind of like, that says no to that astrology. So they have a foothold in authority or credibility in terms of verifying factual data, right? But there are other means of doing it. And so one of the arguments from religious folk who are, I would regard on a spiritual path, say, well, we don't know how historically, factually accurate scripture is, but that's kind of beside the point because it's full of narratives that possess nuance, mythological nuance that transcend time and have value in the context of the human life. That when you value the wrong things, there are certain consequences that follow that are not conducive to the good life or to connection or to love, And so that's the difference between myth and fact and fiction, right? Kind of three different categories. Fiction can be anything that's made up that doesn't correspond with reality. Some fictions have fact in them. Some fictions also have myth in them. Fact is just the raw data that's collected regardless of context. And then myth is the overarching archetypal story that we extract from patterned stories over time, experiences that have universal applicability. Any of that make sense? Word salad. Just, coming up with concepts and distinctions that only exist in relative terms, really. So, two schools of thought were highly present in the rationalism period. That's empiricism and rationalism proper. Empiricism, we mentioned last time, is about extracting data from experiences and from experimentation. And rationalism is about the pursuit of formal, patterned understanding, underlying reality, underlying the concept of a chair, underlying love. What are the formal logical qualities to all of these concepts? Anything. It can be a physical thing or a non-physical thing. It can be an expression. It can be a color. And so that led us to Kant, because Kant was a rationalist who said, those aren't really two separate categories. So he distinguished between two different worlds, the world of phenomena and the world of the noumena. So we'll say just to draw two circles. So Kant didn't question really what the foundations of logic and mathematics and these seemingly transcendental forms that we use to make conceptual sense of things. He didn't really talk too much about where those came from. He took them for granted. He said, well, we have mathematics, let's do physics, let's do science. We have logic, let's argue, let's use our skills of logic and rhetoric to try to find out what is most true. And so all of those things have expressions which are contained in the world of phenomena, because this is all about things that we can observe. It's about any phenomenon that you can pick. So it's things that we can know, regardless of what form that takes. It can be scientific knowledge, it can be religious knowledge, it can be historical knowledge. And it also contains all the tools that we use to gain that knowledge, language. Noumena is more the world of forms. So I'll stick Plato in here, because he was primarily concerned with that world of forms. It's everything that we really can't know the nature of. It's not that he was giving up, it's just that he was using what he had to make rational sense of phenomena. And so if you talk to a physicist and mention Kant, they'll say, oh yeah, he was a physicist who had a philosophical leaning to him. He was actually a philosopher who did physics.
Do you think that over time we're kind of pulling back some of the things that were lost in the fire?
Totally. Oh yeah. I think
It
that's,
just feels like that.
yeah, I think that's what we're doing right now. We're, for sure. Yeah, everything that was lost in the burning in the library of Alexandria. Yeah.
That's what I'm.
We assume it was just all there,
Interesting.
So this is everything we can know and observe. This is everything we can't know. So in a sense, this is what scientifically minded people accuse religious people of being too concerned with, and not enough about this. And this is what religious people accuse more scientifically minded people of being too concerned with without this. But really, this is not this would be a false dichotomy, okay? Which is another logical fallacy. I'm not going to do a class on logical fallacies. We'll just point them out as we go along and find them. False dichotomy. False dichotomy is a conceptual split between two things. And a false dichotomy is one that points at one where it doesn't really exist, at least in relative terms. Terms that are relevant to the argument at hand. So this is actually a Venn diagram. So we have to extend this. And in the middle here, is truth with a capital T.
It feels like right there in that middle is the stuff that was lost.
Yeah, that's all I care about, to be honest with you. You know, that stuff in the middle.
And
And-
figuratively, it's the Vesica Pisces, which is the beginning of form.
Right.
And you got that?
The end and thus also the beginning of the cycle. But also the beginning of the age that we just came out of that was hyper concerned with one of these bubbles and not the other, right? But there's a reason that the two Piscean fish are angled in a cyclical pattern, right? It's because you can't have one side of the dichotomy and not the other, especially when the dichotomy itself is meant to account for all of existence. It's so foolish, you know? So for Kant, ideas with a capital I, that any idea that pointed to a form that had universal phenomenal applicability to it was something transcendental, something that brought those worlds together, the knowable and the unknowable. And as we'll explore more with Huang Po and Plotinus, especially those two guys, anytime they type or say a word with a capital, starting with a capital letter, that represents the universal form of that concept. So we could say there's a difference between small m mind and big M mind. There's a difference between, this would kind of be like self versus self. Even love versus love. Mind represents a mind, an instance of a mind, your mind, your mind, your mind, my mind,
An
etc.
aspect of the big mind.
They are expressions of
Expressions.
yeah.
Like that.
manifestations of big M mind.
It's collective.
Right.
Okay.
It's like collective mind. We don't know exactly what it is, you know. We've failed in our attempt to explain it strictly in terms of neuronal processes in the brain, and we've also kind of failed in our attempt to explain it in terms of, I guess, universal consciousness without having much nuance of what that means on the material level. You know, again, forest for the trees, trees for the forest, confusion. Self is one sense of self. This is the more overarching concept of self that we all possess. You know, it's less ether, less intellectual.
So small O1 and big O1.
Exactly. That I was going to write that one. That's maybe an ultimate example. Yes. And that is one of the ones that Plotinus uses over and over again in his philosophy. Is this distinction? Everything is this, and everything has this. So being isn't about possessing. Being with a capital B, existence with a capital E, isn't about just one manifestation of a thing, but about the overall quality. About oneness. Everything is this. Being is, exists, one. Those are all the same word. Kinda. And my being, my mind, myself, you know, my love for a person is one manifestation of capital L love, as long as it doesn't have conditions attached to it or expectations. You know, full acceptance is there. So the one and the many is a concept in Western philosophy that came up around this time. We're, you know, kind of on track. Actually, more eudaimonia, Socrates, but persists as being important and having lots of examples in every, you know, across schools of thought, across paradigms. That the concept of the many traditionally isn't one that has a capital M, but it just points to the complexity of this. The infinite complexity, we could say. That everything has a quality of identity to it, as well as complexity. So everything is infinitely simple and infinitely complex. And again, it requires attention and having a good set of principles and values for living that will allow you to determine when to look at things in a complex manner and when to look at things in a simple manner, because that's what the schools of thought and psychology kind of point to. Like there are different means toward the same end of mental wellness, and some people have problems and have innate predispositions that incline them toward looking at things more complexly than they really need to. And oftentimes behavioral approaches work very well for that, because the person is too in the head, they're too in the ether, they're too concerned with the many and not enough on the one of just focus and do the thing and it'll all come together. And your mind is rewired through being more embodied and being more in touch with the oneness of anything that you're doing, whether it's gardening or correcting a behavior. And through a habit, it rewires how you think about that. And then conversely, someone who maybe isn't seeing enough complexity is going to see a psychotherapist or psychoanalyst who is going to, you know, and again, it depends on personal values of the person as well. You know, if there is ultimately peace for that person that will come through knowing that the wrong, simple perception that they had about life can be dismantled and they can make sense of more nuance, more complexity, then ultimate peace will be gained. You know, so two different extreme ways of achieving the same result. You can say something. By the way, sorry, I haven't learned everyone's name yet. Yeah. What's your name? Yes. Patty. Alice.
Kathy. With a C.
With a C. With a C. Kate, I know.
Lorraine.
Right. Richard.
You got
Pierrette. Thank you. Almost like pirouette. It's one of my favorite coffee snacks.
But it's what?
It's not pirouette.
I know. Pierrette. Pirouette.
Now this keeps popping into my mind. Started.
Sure.
It's like, what brings us together? You know, the last time I remember this country really getting together was right after 9/11.
Yeah.
And it's like crisis of what's happening. Maybe that's what's happening in Turkey and Syria right now.
Yeah.
Is that crisis of we have one common thing to do, which is to rescue those people to do these
Right.
things. And it's like, things will happen. Things will just happen in society, which means we all have to focus on that one thing.
Right. No one is questioning whether or not they should do that. Right. There is a shouldness. There is an ought claim there that everyone agrees on. So it brings another distinction. Is versus ought. That it's another paradox in a sense that just because something is the case, that doesn't infer an ought. Just because it depends on the value structure underlying the inquiry, right? Why are we doing science? Why are we figuring out how things are? The isness of nature. There's no oughtness embedded in the pursuit. It's another kind of question, right? And so this is an error of reasoning unto itself when people get in debates. They say, well, the facts say this. And then the opponent will say, well, it doesn't mean we have to take this course of action, right? But conversely, there's a paradox that regardless of how things are, or even because of how things are, okay, Turkey and Syria have a massive crisis now, regardless of any other external cultural isness, we don't agree on this form of Islam or what to eat over there, who cares? We ought to help. We ought to hold that value of unity and connection as more foundational in our approach, at least from now. Who knows? Once things settle, if people kind of hold to that and take what we hope people take from crises. I mean, it's one of the reasons crises seem to happen, right? Is to form connection when it was desperately needed in a culture and a society. So we're going through this 3-year crisis, I'm waiting on. It's coming.
We're waiting for the next crisis that's coming.
We're always waiting for the next crisis.
I like that is versus ought. I'm not really fond of the word should all the time.
Yeah, and it depends on your personality too. I don't like hearing the word should. That's for sure. It makes me do the opposite. So some people respond favorably to it.
There's
It's where a
an
cult
end
effect
called
happens.
Wookie Foot, and they have a song that was something like, "Don't shit on me, and I won't shit on you."
Yeah. It works. Yes. So Kant, in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which was his most prominent text, although when we talk about morality and ethics and stuff, I'm going to be diving into one of his other texts because I think it's one of the best and most underrated. Critique of Pure Reason sets these kinds of limits to human understanding that, we do have these kind of two categories of the known and knowable and unknown, but still governing in a certain way, and that truth is here. And he drew conceptual barriers around understanding that. It's a really thick book, as you might expect, especially because he was also a physicist. But at the core of that pursuit was the idea that the human individual is both the source and the object of its actions and its morality, which we could call the governing principles by which it lives. And so the pursuit of truth, that little place in the middle of the Venn diagram, is the source of all things as we can know it and not know it. And it's also the object of any inquiry, insofar as we're concerned with meaning. Because we can inquire about something like, learn about, get obsessed with a particular, era of history, and have a mad scientist, trees without the forest way of approaching that knowledge, and we lose sense of the context of where that fit in history and what point of this particular cycle of thought and humanity it was situated in, and in that is its meaning, that thing that we're losing, When someone says, I just like to learn things, I'm like, oh, that's fine. I mean, that's a preference, to learn things. Like we said last time, you can come to know very much. You can gain a lot of wisdom from very little knowledge or very little experience. And conversely, you can experience a lot and learn nothing if you don't have the right filtering mechanisms in your moral compass for deciding what's worthy of retaining. So, of course, after Kant, there was another movement. He kind of closed the book on rationalism because there was a lot of people are going to disagree with me about this. So it's a good thing I'm just a community education instructor here. But there's evidence in the texts that I will show you on his when he talks about morality that truth is not merely in our rational approach to things, but logic coheres with truth, and logic is a tool. Is just one of many tools for gaining different aspects of truth. There was a transcendental quality because he intentionally spoke of ideas with a capital I, in the same way that Plotinus did, in the same way that we've been doing when we talk about capital O1, capital M mind, that it's merely an ideal. Like, what's the truth? We can't know what the truth is, We have ideas that are true in approximation to the ideal, and there's some kind of transcendental or divine quality to whatever it is that this points to, whatever it is that these point to. It's what we base our yardsticks for measuring things on, in a way. It's like a step beyond measuring things. It's the thing that keeps the act of measuring in check, and that's what values are, right? We can do science, we can produce technology, but what is it for? Not merely in a practical sense. What are the values that are driving our production of technology and how it becomes so complex and so useful and makes our lives so convenient? But there is an end to that if we follow it through, right? If our technology overpowers our individual ability to make choices and pay our own bills and maybe, pay more than the minimum on our credit card, because that's a technology into itself, right? It has negative consequences if we only pay the minimum of our credit card. There's a karmic effect that happens if we follow that action through. It has a consequence that is beyond, it involves negative practical effects, but its nature is beyond that, right? So moral action has an idealistic aim toward good with a capital G, we could say. And what's good doesn't really have conditions attached to it, kind of like love, right? But again, the nature of that maybe will become more clear as when we talk about morality. So the human individual is both the source and the object of morality. God is part of us. We are of God. And we also serve this thing called God or goodness with a capital G by ridding our actions of conditions, which involve having expectations for other people, like performing an act that they're going to ultimately be affected by. So post-Kantian idealists took the idealistic side of Kant's philosophy and focused merely on the I, on the subject. So it went from super objective rationalism basically to Kant, to the other end of the spectrum, ultra-subjectivism. So idealists were super concerned with the I-ness of things, the oneness of the self, sometimes without, and also the oneness of society. Karl Marx came out of the idealistic school of thought, out of idealism, said that, took the Zen concept of we can't really possess things, we can't really own things, and brought it into society, brought it into political philosophy of saying not only can we not possess things, we shouldn't possess anything. We shouldn't own anything. Therefore, in an ideal society, that is one where no one owns anything but has access to everything. All right.
It's like the vow of poverty in Catholic religious life.
Right. It's noble. It's a form of noble poverty, right? That you see in every religious life, really.
The World Economic Forum.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. So with that philosophy, we're not going to be strictly focusing on political philosophy at any point in this little series of classes, but what that obviously leaves out is that there's still a leader, there's still a governor, there's still a president in a socialistic or communistic culture, right? Is that person closer to the individual who possesses nothing, or is it closer to God? Which place on that spectrum of divinity is that person actually situated, or that group of people in the form of an oligarchy? You know, so that's the dilemma that you have to contend with. You know, they say, well, no, but it's for like poverty is noble. There's something intrinsically noble about owning nothing. So what it does is it reduces to materialism, right? They're formulating a political philosophy based on ownership of material goods, which is to say that we're placing maybe too much value on material goods in and of itself. And then you have people like Osho, who wrote books about spirituality and seemed to have a very positive influence on millions of people, who owned a lot of things, who was pretty flashy with his Rolls Royce and his jewelry and stuff. But he argued, well, it's not what you own. I'm not hyper-focused on material substance. I've gained abundance, and I'm choosing to use some of it in this way instead of giving it to a charity over here who God only knows where that money is actually going to end up. You know, some charities actually serve the opposite role that they claim to. You know, we're not in control of, all right, maybe it's the intention that counts, right? But it's not what you have, it's how you manage it, and it's why you retain certain things, and it's how you take care of things. And so it's not wrong to buy a Rolls Royce just because you have the money to do so. I mean, by that logic, it would be the case that it's wrong to take out a loan to buy a crappy Honda Civic because you have to get to work. You know, that's a possession that you get use out of, and Osho still needed a car. He wasn't going into debt over having a car, even though it was a more expensive car than any of us could afford. You know, I'm assuming. So the relativism creeps in, right? What's good relative to what's good to own or okay to own relative to what you actually have. And so, yeah, the idea of noble poverty is one that there's a truth underlying it about ownership per se. Like, we cannot own anything in a spiritual sense, therefore we shouldn't. But is there too much focus on the material? Like, in order to live a good life, to achieve, enlightenment or eudaimonia, must we give up all material possessions? I would argue that that's one means that some have to take in order to see deeper truth and goodness about life, because they have a hyper fixation on material objects, right?
But you said Osho had that sense of abundance. So if I think of, for me, the universe is abundance. And if I think I can't have things, then I'm not thinking instead of abundance. So
Right.
that's a way of looking at it. From my point of view, that's how I look at it. I prefer to think that the universe is abundant and that there are infinite possibilities, and so I want to think in an abundant way.
Right. Well, it makes sense practically too, because why nature gives us everything that we need. And I talked last time about making your needs your wants, in terms of minimizing what you're grasping for externally, like accepting nature has everything in place already, and we still have our uniqueness, we still have our preferences and what we like and dislike. And Osho would say that there's nothing wrong with indulging in that as long as those possessions don't own you. Yeah. And there's no evidence, as far as I can tell, that his Rolls Royce owned him. And that's not to say that the cult effect of certain groups that followed him had the wrong intention or the wrong interpretation of his philosophy. That's just part of human nature. When we get into groups, we have that primal instinct to stick by the group and dissolve our identity into the group and feel empowered because we're serving the greater good. But that's cheap whenever you're not willing to go out on your own, separate from the group, and point out where it's wrong, and when it goes wrong. Yeah. And so many great leaders throughout history have had to denounce their own followers for that reason. And that's it.
And he should have denounced some of his.
Yeah.
Clearly.
I'm sure. I'm absolutely sure. I don't know too much about his actual philosophy, but considering the context, yeah, no doubt. So post-Kantian idealists started to hyperfocus on the subject, and there's a certain amount of bitterness, like underlying, saying we should construct society in terms of like no one having anything, and that's the best. That's the best for everyone. Maybe there's some psychological mechanism driving that one person who believes in that philosophy so strongly that they're not willing to put in the work to earn anything for themselves that they could possess, that they could own. Because if you try hard enough at something for long enough, something will result. Some form of abundance, whether it's in the form of a lesson, you failed, move on to the next thing, or hey, you got what you were working for. Here it is. Here's the reward, and that has a transcendental or transformative effect on our being to reap the benefits of our efforts. So communism in the Marxist sense kind of takes away the opportunity for the individual on many levels to reap, firstly to put effort into anything, because it's an opportunity that we have to take responsibility for things and to kind of earn our way, right? And there needs to be a balance. Like that has to be integrated in society in a way that it works for you, but for everyone else too. Like a business isn't. Like a business is supposed to earn money, but if that's its only value, if that's the only goal, it's not going to work, right? Because what does that imply? If that's the only overarching goal is to make money, then you're not going to value treating your employees right. You're not going to be focusing on quality of your product. So that's not going to last. It's going to crumble at some point. It can't just be about money, because that's just a means of gaining material things, and things beyond material too. But it's a material representation of trade and the gaining of resources, and so what else is a business if not merely a way of making money? It's a means of providing a valuable service to people that's of value in the culture and the society and the town that's situated in, to the neighbor that you live next door, clip their trees, whatever. And also a means of livelihood for some. You're going to employ certain people, and their livelihood and well-being is dependent on your stupid dream of making a bouncy ball business. Like they may find what they need in having a job in that factory in their quest toward the good life, eudaimonia. It seems to be an insignificant thing to a lot of people because a lot of people don't want to work in a factory, especially nowadays, outsourcing everything. But it's merely a means toward that higher goal that we're all striving toward. And that's one part. And it's important to treat that employee with respect and give them what they need to do their job in an efficient way, in a way that they're not taking that energy and that burden home with them, because it's merely a means to that ultimate end. And and so treating that person well is important.
I think the key word to the greater whole of what you just described is reciprocity. There has to be reciprocity. I mean, before there was money, people bartered services, and it was, people reciprocated, and it's like someone's gonna be your wage slave, but you have to. They're gonna give you everything they can, but you have to reciprocate. So
right, and I think that naturally happens when intentions are pure, when intentions are good, when you're there to be present and to just do the job, but also to not get taken advantage of, having a sense of self-authority, but also serving the greater purpose in the tangible ways and also in spiritual ways. And I'm serving, by doing this job, I'm serving the tangible purpose of, earning money and being able to provide for myself and for my family, but also the more spiritual duty that you have toward doing that, and that it's merely a means, and that you can find that means in other things if there's not a good intention overlying the context that you're in. And so I tell, like, I always say when it comes to business and like personality systems, because I've done a little consulting with businesses and integrating personality systems like Myers-Briggs or even astrology and trying to get the most out of individual employees. Like some business owners have to constantly be reminded that your stupid dream is not your employee's dream. It's their livelihood. They have other things going on. Now, some jobs are set up to be part-time jobs, to not be burdened with that much value as to provide everything that a person needs in life. We're seeing that more and more nowadays, where there are more freelance people, not working a 9 to 5. And with the collapse of the 9 to 5 concept, who knows what the next form is going to take. It kind of seems like every man for themselves right now. But as my dad says, he's retired, and I'm just glad I'm on my way out. You guys have fun with that. So can't have too much emphasis on as rationalism did, the objective, formal, logical properties of things, because there's really no practical essence to that. And then as the idealists kind of got wrong in certain political philosophies and stuff, can't focus too much on the subject as being the subject being hyperimposed onto a society or onto humanity. It's like idealistic, if it's not grounded in the tangible at all, if there's no grounding in both things, right, in the ether and the tangible, then, and it doesn't make sense in both realms, then it's not going to last, right? And Kant tried to kind of bring those worlds together. But moving on, analytical philosophy grew out of Kant, and that kind of moved out of idealism and back toward the more rationalistic approach to things. Gottlob Frege worked on mathematical logic, tried to reduce mathematics to logical principles. Kind of failed, but we'll say that So basically what he tried to say was this. This is a hyper generalization, but so he and Bertrand Russell, to some degree, but mostly Frege, tried this whole career to say that A and, this is the logical symbol for and, just a centered dot, any variable here, and B equals C, another variable, or therefore, say A and B, therefore C, is an equivalent statement to 1 plus 2 equals 3. That, in a sense, these are variables, and these are variables, and if we plug anything into A, B, C, anything into apply this mathematical equation to anything, that they can say the same thing. Like he tried to reduce this to this, that mathematics was this symbolic language that had its roots in logic. And all I'm going to really say to that is that you're using the same hemisphere of your brain when you're doing formal logic as you are when you're doing algebra. I found that my algebra skills actually skyrocketed after I took an advanced logic course, where I was doing logical proofs and deducing logical statements from other logical statements.
Would you spell his last name, please?
Oh, Frege. Got it. At the same time Frege was doing that, Bertrand Russell, who we talked about last time, was also working on mathematical logic, was kind of an activist for logic, I would say. The school of thought is called logical positivism. And not only is it trying to reduce mathematics to symbolic logic, but language. That the formal properties of language, like the use of conjunctions and pronouns and every formal aspect of language can be reduced to certain aspects of formal logic. And so it was like a hyper left-brained pursuit. But he was kind of a logical activist in a way, that he tried to combine, he more or less stuck by the verification principle, which is an attempt to combine meaning with logical verification. So take formal logical proofs like modus ponens, if P then Q, P therefore Q. Tried to say that could account for meaning, that pure left brain logic could account for meaning in some sense. So what that actually reduces to is a form of radical empiricism, because we still have to contend with our experiences. Remember, empiricism is about gaining knowledge of reality. Reality is experience, basically. And so what we have to do in the case of logical positivism is make all of reality, including non-tangible things like love and connection and what we might agree meaning itself, those things can be reduced or at least verified by hardcore left-brained logic. And Wittgenstein, the effect of this is very interesting because Bertrand Russell didn't really lead a very virtuous life. His teacher, Albert North Whitehead, and him always had feuds and were like sleeping with each other's wives and stuff like that. Like their personal lives were just in disarray, Meanwhile, they were seeing themselves as being these like ivory tower philosophers, talking about virtue as being something that could be accounted for by mathematical logic. Yeah, come on.
You don't seem to think much of that.
Not really. I like Wittgenstein. So he came along and he was like, but what are we doing when we are doing philosophy?
I just spelled his name.
Oh, okay.
It's gonna be a long one.
Yeah.
When you start with the letter, I thought.
Yeah, I know.
I know.
Spelled it wrong.
I was writing his first name, and those maybe the first name was Wally
Ludwig. Yeah. So Wittgenstein came along and he was like, what are we doing when we're doing philosophy? What are we doing when we speak? So last time I talked a little bit about Wittgenstein's early theory of language. The limits of my language are the limits of my world. That was his early idea. When he was having fights with Bertrand Russell and saying look at your life, as opposed to the strictness of your philosophy. Very organized over here. You're at 800 words on how logic and mathematics share an origin, and how all of meaning can be accounted for it. But then you're sleeping with your teacher's wife. Where does it converge? Okay, because philosophy is part of life. So Wittgenstein was like, well, philosophy is an activity. There's an active part of doing logic, of reasoning. And that happens within the context of a life. So where is the convergence between, language and logic and all this stuff that y'all are going deep on, and life as we know it? And so his early idea was, well, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Our experience is contained within these, our conception, our formal conception of how we speak, how we reason through things. And the smarter, the more intelligent you are, the more tools you have for accessing experiences. It's not about the senses at all. Meanwhile, Wittgenstein was living in a very small hut in northern Norway, in the mountains, completely isolated from civilization. Okay? So he had his own problems to deal with. He was a guy who came into, anyone familiar with the Vienna Circle? It was this collection of intellectuals at the time. We're talking early 20th century. So it was a group of intellectuals in Vienna, and it was a combination of philosophers and astronomers and scientists and things. And he wasn't really part of the group, but he would kind of pop in every now and then and ask a question, say, no, I think you're getting all of this wrong. That's not how logic and language and science and real life actually converge. I know because I've been living in an ivory tower in the mountains in Norway for all this time. So I've had time to myself. I'm not, getting in the mess of this group talk stuff that you guys are doing. So he would pose a problem to them, and then they'd be like, oh my God, that's interesting. Didn't look at it that way. And then he would go off back to Norway or Cambridge or wherever he was staying at the time. And they would work on that problem for 2 years, and then he'd come back and do the same thing, tear it all down.
It's weird you share, but Russell, they seemed like they were using their philosophy to justify what they did
Totally.
in the world.
Totally, yeah. And Wittgenstein was on a genuine path, I believe, because I've read his biography, and a lot of it was in part an autobiography, that he was just trying to make all these complex concepts in philosophy and logic cohere with eudaimonia and mind and one and goodness. And he was on a pursuit to how to logically make sense of living a good life and to not get caught up in all the mess. So that's why he was such a recluse. But he changed his mind about limits of my formal language or the limits of my world. And he started to look more at the context of basically what we can confirm through the common knowledge that communication is in very small part linguistic and logical, that you can kind of feel in your body if something is true or false or well-intended or not. not necessarily through what the person is saying, but through their overall demeanor and through the words they use and their tone and how they use language, and through their expressions and through their movements, and not just through visual things either. There's just intuition. We talked about last time, if something fires up our truth antenna, our intuition, then it's kind of just, we know it's true or well intended or good, right?
It's like energy.
Yeah.
Energy.
Yeah, for sure. So exactly. It's all energy, baby, like Wittgenstein went to Sedona, he did ayahuasca, pretty sure, and he saw the oneness, he's like, no, language is just part of it, guys.
Ayahuasca in Sweden.
Yeah, so I totally lost. Yeah. So then he's like, what are we doing when we speak? Not only what are we doing, because the question what can be confined to more the material. That's kind of what we're trying to get away from right now, right? Can we ever say what we mean became his new concern. Can we ever say what we mean? Because meaning is, we take it for granted. Things mean things. We can't get away from that. And we have an existential crisis when there's a crisis of meaning within us. And that's what he was constantly battling with. And that's what led him to see that we're actually playing language games in order to, in quite a messy way, dance around the fire of truth, or dance around the fire of whatever concept we're trying to get to the bottom of, or whatever it is within us we're trying to express. And then it kind of brings us back to religion, like there are good and bad ways to interpret the messages in Scripture, right? Christ is the way, the truth, and the light. He is the fire. Or he's like one way of conceptualizing our intuition, our moral sensibilities, and to some extent was an example in his material life for one way to live the good life. Not all of us want the same ultimate conclusion to our life that Christ had. But the idea that there's a steady burning fire within us means that we get burned even when we dig deeply enough into ourselves and into our own perceptions and our own delusions. If we really want to change for the better, we have to contend with the fire that's right there or right in here. And people fear getting burned, But to contend with that and know how to tame it, you can't own it, but you can tame it, right? You can feed it. You can feed it to the extent that it blows out of control and it burns the whole building down, you and everyone else around. That's if you give in to your natural inclinations too much. You have a sense of oneness that can lead to selfishness and narcissism. That your steady burning fire inside of you is a bonfire that spun out of control. Conversely, you can be a complete doormat and not even know that you have a self-authority, And so neither is very good. That's my philosopher's analysis. Neither is very good. So continental philosophy, analytical philosophy kind of led us to Wittgenstein. So this is the dichotomy, the false dichotomy I would argue that we're stuck with today in academic philosophy in the West, is this split between analytical and continental. So analytical is all about concepts and logic and making these distinctions, and then Wittgenstein came along and talked more about context. And when we do philosophy, what are we doing? We're playing language games in order to understand things, both in philosophy and in life. You sit on that directly on the fire of truth for too long, you get burned, but you can orient yourself so that you never lose sight of it. But also you can sort of dance with others around it. Use it as a means of connection and togetherness, rather than something that burns each individual person or burns everyone else. You know? So analytical. It's all about logic and stuff. Versus continental. And Wittgenstein is kind of responsible for this split. Basically, what it means in academic philosophy is that left-brain people gravitate toward this side of philosophy, right-brain people gravitate toward continental philosophy, because they get a little bit too forest rather than trees. You know, oh, it's all about energy and oneness, man. You know, but how do I balance my checkbook? You know. We're doing well.
You are.
Oh, thank you. So phenomenology, actually, I can't even put it under continental, although in formal terms, phenomenology is a continental pursuit. Not to be confused with observable stuff necessarily, like not in an objective sense, but the study of the appearances of things. We take for granted that there are certain things that precede the mind, in a small mind. And phenomenology is trying to account for the phenomenon that we all have different ways of seeing the same things. So it gets very psychological. So modern philosophy of psychology kind of broke off of phenomenology. Psychoanalysts of the 20th century, Freud, Jung, they were kind of philosophically, and some would say that they're phenomenologists. That school of thought happened around the same time, early to mid 20th century. And meanwhile, in philosophy studies, phenomenology was huge. So there was a lot of overlap. So phenomenal objects, subjective objects, are themselves the objects of their thoughts. So a phenomena is a in a sense, a self-referential instant, or how do I say? Rephrase that. Okay. I'll just go back to how I have this written already.
Do that.
Phenomenal objects are themselves the objects of their thoughts. So we're studying being. We're studying the self. More small s self and how it fits into the greater context of objective reality. So how does consciousness of an object work? Husserl distinguished between objective study of science, which is studying the thing in itself, trying to set aside our subjective preferences for anything, and studying the qualities of a phenomenon, whether it's a social phenomenon that we can observe in a culture, or how a frog works. We're detaching the observer from the phenomenon itself. And that philosophy was more concerned with studying the thing which thinks. So under phenomenology, there were objective phenomena that we can have a sense of, but we never get to the essence of the thing, because we're still subjective beings that are doing science and observing it. In what sense does the side of the tomato that we can't see exist? It exists objectively, but if we can't see it, how relevant is it to us as subjective beings? Maybe we'll eat this side of it and eat the other side of the tomato later. I don't know. It's kind of, you can see where this goes, though. You know, if we take these distinctions to their logical conclusion. Just eat this.
So who would you name trained as a phenomenologist.
Yeah, if there's anyone you want to look up, Husserl. I don't know how to spell it. Yeah. Husserl, U-S-S-U. Yeah, that's right. Husserl. And Heidegger. Two names. It was prominent in German philosophy. So we go down all kinds of conceptual rabbit holes about, the self not being able to contend with things in and of themselves, but having an experience of it that we can both point to as being different from each other's, but also share. There are also qualities of things in and of themselves that escape subjective debate, right? And so that's why the distinction between science and philosophy is kind of, they're two different activities, but they have to converge if either is doing their work meaningfully or in a way that's useful. So intentionality, this leads us to intentionality, which is the relation between mental states and its object, as being something that we kind of take for granted, that we aim all states of mind in reference to objects, but not in strict terms of objects. Like, we have to contend with objects, and our intention and motivation and the goal that we set for ourselves has an underlying value structure that in and of itself is the regulating mechanism for our actions and our beliefs. So intentionality, let's see where. The concept of intentionality kind of takes us back to Aristotle, who spoke of character, moral character, as being something different from a simple set of preferences, subjective preferences, but rather an integrated combination of what makes us unique as individuals and what gives us identity, and preferring one thing over another, and also what is good with a capital G, in terms of what we should do, and the habits that we form in pursuit of formulating our character. That character isn't taken for granted. What you are is basically your set of natural inclinations, which you can act on for good or act against for good. And that we have a duty to ourselves to cultivate our habits so that we don't have to ask a moral question every time we act. We create a context within ourselves that I think the Stoics were kind of aiming toward as well, of presence of mind, but also not losing sight of compassion and what makes a society work, and also in what makes a business work, right? It can't just be about money, and it can't just be about quality of the product itself. Your money will suffer if it's simply the latter, and if it's simply either, the quality of life for your employees will suffer, right? So character is cultivated over time. So Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is a good book on moral virtue and how to cultivate character from his perspective. I'll spell that on the board if you want. And let's see where I can wrap up.
So kind of, that's why they call it a moral compass. It's your constant. Yeah.
Right, because the direction is not linear, toward cultivating character. You have to contend with the world and experience things and hit some rough rapids on your raft down the river of truth and life. You have to dock it and get out and view that with that bird's eye perspective, what's around the corner. But at some point, you have to get back on and deal with those bends. You can't just beeline it through these obstacles. You have to find an intelligent way around it, or through it, over it, under it. The journey of life is not linear, but there is a direction, and we're cultivating our character insofar as that goal, that destination, is, according to philosophers, truth with a capital T, or capital I, ideal, whether it's the ideal way to live, or good with a capital G. It's what eudaimonia is aiming us toward. What's good, what's true, what provides us with a good life. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Doesn't mean it has to be more difficult than people like to convince themselves of as well, And that's where logic comes in, and the analytical approach to things can help to inform the continental and whole oneness energy thing, approach to understanding reality. There's coherence and logical regularities in nature, but things are also infinitely in flux. And to say that everything, especially values that we use to cultivate our character, can be reduced to things that we can measure with a yardstick, or apply strict, universal, anti-temporal, numerical values to, is also a mistake. So we're not going to be really answering these questions. Philosophy is just about pointing out where the errors are. So that'll do it for this week, guys. Thanks for coming
Thank
in.
you.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
Of course. Cheers.
So give us a hint, what's next week?
I actually haven't decided yet.
You've been in Sedona too long.
Oh gosh, only a year.
You're in the flow.